Story 1. It was close to midnight, and the only thing on my mind was getting home. I'd taken a back road to shave some time off the drive, the kind of narrow, isolated stretch of asphalt that threads through farmland and woods with barely a house in sight. I told myself it would be faster, but really I just liked avoiding traffic and being alone with my thoughts. The road was empty, just the faint hum of the engine and the wind slipping through the cracked window. It was peaceful at first, but the farther I drove, the heavier the night began to feel, like something pressing down on me. Maybe it was just fatigue setting in, or maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen another car for the last 15 miles. As I rounded a tight curve, my headlights caught something ahead. A line of wooden boards spread neatly across the road. They were packed with nails, some of them jutting out at awkward angles. My tires squealed as I hit the brakes, stopping just short of the planks. The boards spanned the entire road, too perfectly placed to be an accident. My first instinct was to throw the car into reverse, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, my heart dropped. More planks. They were behind me too, laid out neatly across both lanes. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The silence pressed in, thick and smothering, broken only by the quiet hum of my idling engine. This wasn't random. Someone had set this up, and I was the target. I stared out into the woods on either side of the road, but it was impossible to see past the first few rows of trees. The darkness out there felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. The longer I sat there, the louder my pulse pounded in my ears. I knew I had to do something. Sitting here in the middle of nowhere wasn't an option. But getting out of the car? No way. I'd heard stories about traps like this. Someone forces you to stop, you step out to check the damage, and they come out of the woods. You never see it coming until it's too late. I cracked the window, just enough to hear outside. For a moment, there was only silence. Then from somewhere in the brush to my right, I heard it, a shuffle, soft and deliberate, like someone testing the ground. My stomach twisted. Someone was out there. Maybe more than one. My hand drifted to the gear shift, and I exhaled slowly through my nose. I had one shot. If I hit the gas hard enough, maybe I could plow through the planks and keep going. Sure, I'd blow a couple tires, but I'd rather deal with that on the highway than out here. The moment I touched the shift, movement flickered at the edge of my vision, a shadow slipping between the trees. My heart jumped into my throat. Whoever was out there knew I was trapped, and they were waiting for me to panic. I fought the urge to throw the door open and run. No matter what, stay in the car. The thought repeated itself like a mantra. I couldn't tell if it was instinct or fear, but I knew stepping outside would be the worst mistake I could make. I shifted into reverse, keeping my foot light on the pedal to avoid spinning out. Slowly, I backed away from the front planks, tires crunching on loose gravel. The boards cracked under the pressure, but I kept inching backward, heart racing with every second. The second my back tires hit the planks behind me, I floored it. The car jolted as the nails sank into the rubber, and I felt the sickening thud of a tire blowing out. The car swerved wildly, but I held the wheel steady, grinding over the boards with a horrible screech of metal and wood. I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The car wobbled and groaned as the tires shredded beneath me. But I kept going, steering hard as the road opened up into a straightaway. I could feel the rims chewing into the asphalt, but I didn't care. 15 minutes later, I hit the main highway, gasping for breath. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, tires hissing and rubber flapping uselessly off the rims. The fluorescent lights above the lot felt like salvation. I sat in the car for a long time, hands shaking, trying to convince myself it was over. My pulse still hammered in my ears, and every shadow outside the gas station made me flinch. I didn't call the cops. I wasn't even sure what I'd tell them. Eventually, I got out to inspect the damage. Both rear tires were gone, shredded to ribbons by the nails. The boards had done their job. As I waited for the tow truck, I just stood there, heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself that I'd made it out. I did eventually call the cops once I got home safely, but I've got any update regarding it. Story number 2. A few months ago, I was driving home after a night out with a friend. We had just watched a play, and by the time I hit the road, it was close to midnight. Living in rural America, I'm used to long, lonely drives with nothing but farmland, forest, and the occasional winding road to keep me company. That night, I decided to take a back road to save time. It was the kind of narrow, unlit road where you don't expect to see another car, and the isolation usually feels peaceful, until it doesn't. The drive started quietly, with only the hum of my engine and the wind slipping through the cracked window. I've always enjoyed driving at night, especially on roads like these, where it feels like the world belongs only to me. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. The air felt heavier, pressing down on me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was just fatigue setting in, or maybe it was the eerie emptiness of the road. I hadn't seen another car in over 15 miles, and that started to gnaw at me. I told myself to relax, but the unease was hard to ignore. As I crossed a narrow bridge, my headlights illuminated a car parked along the shoulder. Its engine was running, but there were no hazard lights and no sign of anyone standing near it. It wasn't unusual for people to pull over in this spot, so I thought nothing of it. But as I passed, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and my heart skipped a beat. The car had pulled out and was now following me. At first, I brushed it off. It's not uncommon for cars to end up behind you on country roads. Maybe they were just heading the same way. But then they started tailgating me, so close that their headlights flooded my mirrors. It struck me as odd. The road was full of sharp curves, and this stretch was known for sudden deer crossings. Most drivers took it slow, especially at night, but not this one. They stuck to me like glue, practically daring me to go faster. The longer they stayed on my bumper, the harder it was to stay calm. My frustration gave way to a knot of anxiety twisting in my gut. Something about this situation felt off, and the farther we drove, the stronger the feeling grew. Then, without any warning, the car's headlights blinked off, plunging everything behind me into darkness. My stomach dropped. I was alone on a rural road, miles from anywhere, and the only other car had just gone dark right behind me. My pulse pounded in my ears as my mind raced. I slowed down slightly, trying to figure out what they were doing. Were they playing a prank, trying to scare me? I didn't have time to think. Suddenly, the car swerved into the opposite lane and sped past me, its tires squealing on the asphalt. Relief washed over me until they cut in front of me and slammed on their brakes, coming to a dead stop right in the middle of the road. Panic surged through me. I didn't know what they wanted, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. My heart pounded as I yanked the wheel to the side, narrowly missing their bumper as I swerved around their car. I hit the gas, tires screeching as I sped off into the night. The road twisted and turned, but I barely noticed. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see their headlights chasing me, but there was nothing. Every shadow along the roadside felt like a threat, and every second that passed without seeing them was a small victory. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the safety of my driveway. I slammed the car into park, jumped out, and sprinted to my front door. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys, the lock feeling impossibly slow to turn. When I finally got inside, I locked every door and window in the house, double-checking them all, just to be sure. I sat on the couch for a long time, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, and every creak of the house made me flinch. I peeked through the blinds a few times, half expecting to see that car lurking somewhere outside, but the street was empty. I never saw the car around my house, yet I wish I knew why someone would drive like that. Story number 3. When I was a kid living in a small town called Bayview, my dad decided to take me and my cousin Ryan out one summer night to use up the last of our leftover fireworks. We took a remote back road that led to a boat launch tucked deep into the woods, right along a river channel that fed into the ocean. The place, called Miller's Cove, was isolated, sparsely populated, and completely dark at night. Just the kind of spot where you could light fireworks without bothering anyone. The drive out there felt like an adventure at first. The moonlight made the trees along the road look almost silver, and the air was cool with the scent of pine and salt water. When we pulled into the gravel parking lot by the dock, everything was eerily quiet except for the distant lapping of water against the wooden posts. There were no other people around, or so we thought. As we got closer to the dock, we saw it, a 20-foot powerboat tied to the pier, rocking gently on the water. A group of men stood by the boat, hauling large, heavy boxes into the back of an SUV parked nearby. The air around them felt thick with tension, like we had stumbled onto something we shouldn't have. What immediately caught my attention were the white rubber boots they all wore, the kind fishermen usually have. But these men didn't look like fishermen. There was also a sleek, low sports car parked beside the SUV. It was way too fancy for a place like this, though I couldn't tell exactly what model it was, just that it stood out, gleaming under the faint moonlight. A cold knot twisted in my stomach as we realized what was going on. My dad glanced at the men and muttered, "Stay quiet." He didn't waste a second. He threw the car into reverse, turned us around, and sped out of the lot as fast as the old Subaru could manage. Ryan and I stayed quiet, our senses on high alert. I couldn't shake the feeling that those men were watching us, tracking every movement we made. My heart pounded in my chest as we pulled back onto the road, gravel crunching loudly under the tires. About 30 seconds later, Ryan twisted in his seat and whispered, "There's a car behind us." I turned to look, and sure enough, headlights were barreling down the road toward us. They were coming fast, too fast. My dad slammed his foot on the gas pedal, and the Subaru's engine groaned as we raced down the winding road. We hit 80 miles per hour, but the car behind us was still gaining. The road twisted sharply through the forest, and every curve felt like a trap waiting to spring. My dad muttered under his breath, "This has to be drug-related." His knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he fought to keep the car steady. The old Subaru wasn't built for high-speed chases, and it was starting to show. The tires squealed every time we hit a curve, and the suspension groaned under the strain. My heart was in my throat, and I kept glancing back, expecting the other car to ram us off the road at any second. "We're not going to outrun them," my dad said through clenched teeth. Just before the next bend in the road, he made a split-second decision. He killed the headlights, cut the engine, and swerved off the road into the driveway of a house buried beneath tall pine trees. The Subaru rolled to a stop on the gravel, hidden in the shadows. "Get down," he whispered, and we all ducked low in our seats. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest as we listened to the roar of the approaching car. It flew past us, its engine screaming, headlights slicing through the night. The car must have been going over 100 miles per hour, and it didn't slow down for a second. We stayed perfectly still, too afraid to move, until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. I started to relax, but then the car reappeared, this time speeding back toward the boat launch. We stayed huddled in the dark, listening to the tires crunch on gravel as it turned back into the lot. Minutes felt like hours as we waited, every rustle of leaves making my pulse race. Finally, my dad started the car, eased back onto the road, and took the long way home to make sure no one was following us. None of us said a word during the drive. When we finally reached home, we locked every door and window, still shaken by what had just happened. To this day, I don't know what was going on at Miller's Cove that night. All I know is that whatever we saw, we weren't supposed to see it, and we were lucky to get away when we did. Story number 4. One summer, we were on a cross-country camping trip, spending every night in a new campground. By that point, we had been traveling for over 2 weeks, setting up tents under the stars and falling asleep to the sound of crickets and rustling leaves. Every night, we stayed in campgrounds listed in a AAA guidebook. Most of them were popular and packed with other campers, so we always felt comfortable surrounded by people. One night, we found a campground in the guide that had excellent ratings, and it was free. We were tired and eager to set up camp, so it sounded perfect. The place was tucked deep into the forest, far off the main highway, and we figured it would be a peaceful spot to recharge. It was already late by the time we pulled off the road and into the campground. The forest canopy above was so thick that the moonlight barely broke through, casting faint silver streaks along the dirt path. As we drove deeper into the campground, my excitement started to fade, and a knot began forming in my stomach. The guidebook had promised this place was popular, but something felt off. There were dozens of campsites, each one neatly marked with stone fire pits and picnic tables. But they were all empty, every single one. Not a single camper in sight. At first, my parents figured we just arrived late. maybe after everyone had already turned in for the night. But as we kept driving through the rows of campsites, we noticed there were no signs of life. No parked cars, no tents, no glowing campfires, and no sounds beyond the steady hum of our car's engine. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. Even the forest, which should have been alive with the chirping of insects and croaking frogs, was disturbingly silent. I tried to brush it off, but the absence of sound gnawed at me. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I remember feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was only 12 at the time, but something in my gut screamed that this wasn't a place we should stay. I leaned forward in my seat and whispered, "Can we please leave? I don't like this place." My parents exchanged glances, their expressions uneasy. "Let's drive around a little more," my dad said, though he didn't sound convinced. We continued down the narrow dirt road, the headlights bouncing along the ruts in the path. Every empty campsite we passed only made the unease grow stronger. The deeper we went, the more suffocating the forest felt. The air seemed thicker, heavier somehow, and every shadow looked darker than it should. My mom shifted nervously in her seat, tapping her fingers on the armrest. "It is weird," she finally admitted. "Maybe we should go." Then something strange happened, something I'll never forget. As we rounded a corner, our headlights swept across a cluster of campsites, and I swear I saw movement in the tree line. Just for a split second, a figure, dark and hunched, slipping between the trees. It was so fast I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. "Did you see that?" I whispered, but neither of my parents responded. My dad just kept driving, a little faster now, the tires crunching over the gravel. The road looped around, bringing us back toward the entrance. The whole campground had been deserted, yet the longer we stayed, the more it felt like we weren't alone. My stomach churned, and I could tell my parents felt it too, though they tried to play it off. Finally, my dad let out a low sigh. "Yeah, let's not stay here." He didn't wait for any objections. He threw the car into reverse, turned us around, and headed back toward the highway. We drove in silence for a while, the eerie stillness of the campground clinging to us like a heavy fog. I stared out the window, watching the dark forest blur past, and couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us from the trees. We never found out what the deal was with that campground, why it was empty, or why it felt so wrong. I've camped in remote places since then, but nothing has ever creeped me out as much as that night did. Even now, thinking about it gives me chills. Story number 5. This happened around 7 years ago, back when I was 22 and living with a roommate while attending college. I'm a woman, and like many students, I was balancing school, social life, and my sanity. One weekday evening, my roommate let me know she was going out clubbing and planned to stay over at a friend's house. She invited me along, but I wasn't in the mood to party that night. I figured I'd stay home, watch junk TV, and maybe work on some assignments. Around 10 p.m., I decided to make a quick run to the gas station to grab candy and energy drinks. It was one of those nights where everything felt easy and light. I had gotten out of class early, my hair looked great from an afternoon salon visit, and I was feeling confident in my skin. When I pulled up at the gas station, there were 3 guys hanging around inside. They looked like typical frat boys, maybe in their mid-20s, chatting and laughing while loitering near the snacks aisle. One of them had shaggy blonde hair and was covered in tattoos. I noticed him nudge his friend and nod in my direction, but I brushed it off as nothing. It wasn't uncommon for guys to glance over at me, something I'd learned to ignore. They paid for their things before me and walked out, leaving the store just as I grabbed my snacks and energy drinks. When I walked out into the parking lot, I noticed them sitting in a beat-up old car, all 3 of them watching me. I told myself they were probably just bored and ignored the uneasy feeling creeping up the back of my neck. I climbed into my car and headed home. My apartment was only a few minutes away, so I didn't think much about the guys as I drove. But as soon as I pulled out of the gas station, their car started up and followed. At first, I figured it was just a coincidence. They were probably heading in the same direction. But as I entered my neighborhood and made a series of turns, their car stayed behind me at every twist and curve. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I lived deep within a subdivision with lots of winding roads and dead ends. There was no reason for anyone to follow me this far unless they were coming to the same place, and I knew they weren't. My stomach tightened with dread. I was home alone that night, and the thought of them knowing where I lived made me panic. I drove past my street without stopping, hoping they would turn off. They didn't. Instead, they sped up, staying on my bumper. I made my way out of the neighborhood and back onto the main road. My hands were shaking on the wheel as I tried to think. They followed me closely, their headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. I considered driving to the police station, but it was at least 15 minutes away, with a bunch of stoplights along the route. If they blocked me in at a red light, I'd have no way out. The road we were on became more deserted the farther I drove. I glanced at the gas gauge, half a tank. I didn't have a plan, and panic started to set in. Just then, they sped up and pulled alongside me, rolling down their windows. For a moment, I let myself think maybe I had a flat tire, or something was wrong with my car. Maybe they were just trying to help. But when I looked over, I saw the blonde one leering at me with a grin that made my stomach turn. I slammed my foot on the gas. They swerved toward my car, their tires screeching as they tried to nudge me off the road. I could hear their laughter, loud, cruel, and taunting. I gripped the wheel tighter, heart racing, as I tried to think of what to do. Then I remembered my sister's house. She lived about 15 minutes away, in the opposite direction of the police station. It wasn't ideal, but I knew her husband Josh was in the military and owned guns. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone and dialed her number. She picked up on the fourth ring, sounding confused. I cut straight to the point. "Is Josh home?" "Yeah," she said slowly, clearly puzzled. "Tell him to get his gun and meet me in the driveway. Please," I begged, my voice cracking. Before she could ask any questions, I dropped the phone. At that moment, one of the guys threw something, maybe a plastic Coke bottle, at my window. It hit with a loud thunk, making me jump. I sped toward my sister's house, barely breathing. As I pulled into the driveway, I realized with a sinking heart that the house was dark. No porch light, no signs of life. Were they even home? Had I misunderstood her? The guys pulled in behind me, blocking my way out. They all climbed out of their car and started toward me. The blonde guy yanked on my driver's side handle, testing it. His expression was cold, detached, and predatory, like this was routine for him. The other two circled the car, trying the other doors. I was frozen, fumbling for my phone again, mind racing with questions. Should I try to run? Do I have anything in the car to defend myself? Should I just stay locked inside? In that split second, two things happened. First, I locked eyes with the blonde guy. His gaze was empty, like he wasn't just playing around. He knew exactly what he was doing. Then from the shadows behind him, I heard a loud bang. The guys flinched and turned around. My brother-in-law, Josh, stepped out from behind the house, gun drawn, his face like stone. "Get the fuck out of here," he barked. Without hesitation, the guys scrambled back into their car, cursing and shouting as they sped off into the night. My sister ran out and pulled me inside. We locked the doors and called the police. They took our statements and said they'd patrol the area, but without a license plate number, there wasn't much they could do. To this day, I still wonder what those men wanted and what might have happened if Josh hadn't been there. Whatever their intentions were, I'm just glad I didn't have to find out. Story number 6. When I was 19, I got off work early one night at about 3 a.m. I always took the back roads to avoid highways. There was no traffic that late, and the back route was almost a straight shot home, running directly south from my job. It was a quiet stretch of road without any streetlights, and once you went about 2 miles, it turned into a dirt road with a few scattered four-way stops. That night, the fog was thick, so thick that my visibility was barely a few yards in front of me. I was driving cautiously, sticking to about 30 miles per hour. The fog seemed to muffle every sound, making the world feel smaller and stranger, and I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest as I crept through the night. I kept my eyes on the road, doing my best to stay calm, but everything felt off. The usual landmarks I relied on, mailboxes, trees, even bends in the road, seemed to dissolve into the swirling mist. As I made my way toward one of the four-way stops, I focused on a familiar marker. An old lamppost that stood in the middle of a yard just off the intersection. That lamppost had become a kind of mental checkpoint for me. It stood halfway between the house tucked behind it and the road, and whenever I saw it, I knew I was heading in the right direction. I had been looking out for it all night, hoping the sight of it would cut through the strange tension building in my chest. As I rolled up to the stop sign, headlights dim in the fog, I spotted the lamppost, and then I saw it. A man, or at least something shaped like a man, was standing beside the lamppost. He didn't move. He didn't wave or look toward me. He just stood there, as still as a statue facing the road. The fog swirled around him, and in the faint yellow glow from the lamppost, his figure looked distorted, almost unreal. Every hair on my body stood on end. Goosebumps rippled across my arms, and my heart started pounding in my chest. Something about him, or it, was wrong. It wasn't just the fact that someone was standing there at 3 a.m. on a foggy, deserted road. It was the way he stood, perfectly still, as if he'd been waiting. Watching. I sat frozen at the stop sign for a moment, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands, trying to convince myself that it was just a person, maybe a guy waiting for someone, or maybe he'd wandered outside for some reason. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. My heart raced as I slowly eased my foot off the brake and rolled through the intersection, my eyes glued to the figure. He didn't move, not an inch. He just stayed there beside the lamppost, standing as still as death itself. As I crossed the intersection and drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, even though I didn't dare look back. The road beyond the stop was all dirt, and the cornfields on either side loomed high, their stalks swaying gently in the night breeze. The fog clung to the ground in thick waves, wrapping itself around my car. My headlights barely cut through it, making the world outside feel more like a dream than reality. I kept my speed at 30 miles per hour, afraid to go any faster in case something, or someone, stepped out from the cornfields. My mind raced with images of that figure, imagining him emerging from the misty rows, blocking the road ahead, waiting for me. I tried to shake the thoughts, but I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my ears and my hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel. I felt like a hunted animal, driving through a trap I didn't understand. Every shadow in the fog, every rustle of the corn, felt like it could be him. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the walls of corn closing in on either side. All I could think was, what if he's waiting up ahead? What if he steps out in front of my car? I had no plan, no idea what I'd do if he did. I drove on, heart hammering, bracing myself for something to happen. Anything. But nothing did. Eventually, the fog began to thin, and I saw the familiar outline of my driveway in the distance. Relief washed over me like a wave, but my hands were still shaking as I pulled into my driveway and cut the engine. Even after I was home, safe inside my room, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. Who was he? Why was he standing there? And how did he seem to know I'd be passing by that night? I'll never know who or what I saw that night, but whatever it was, it made me feel like I didn't belong on that road. And maybe I wasn't supposed to make it home. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.